Right, hello and welcome to our Quality in Action webinar series hosted by the Mentoring Partnership of Minnesota. Our topic this month is federal funding for mentoring, the past, present, and future. We have lots of people logging in and getting onto the webinar right now, but we want to start on time so we can cover all of our information and allow time for some questions. So welcome again. Next, we'll just go over some of the webinar logistics. Some of you have been on lots of our monthly webinars and know all of this already, but for those of you who are new, my name is April Reardon. I am the Director of Training and Community Partnerships and am typically on most of these webinars. I am really assisting Alicia this time around, our AmeriCorps Promise Fellow, who's also has really taken the lead along with our panelists to put this webinar together for you this month. To ask questions and share comments during the webinar, we really encourage that. You can do that at any time. We will have a designated kind of Q&A time towards the end, but feel free to use the control panel to ask questions and make comments throughout the webinar. You can click on the little hand in your control panel that will alert the organizers here, the MPM staff, to unmute you. Everyone is muted during the webinar just to control that background noise and sound. The other option, if you aren't using your phone or don't have a headset or microphone so that you can talk during the webinar, you can also type questions and comments into the question section on your control panel. And you can type technical questions or things that I can just respond directly to you with, or if it's a comment or question for the entire group, then one of us will just share that and get that response for you. If you do raise your hand and are talking, then just be sure to monitor your background noise. One thing that is new here is that typically in the past, recordings of our webinars have only been available on our Facebook page. Oh, I see a little typo down there. On our Facebook page, but we've also recently added a YouTube channel for the Mentoring Partnership of Minnesota. So those recordings are there. And even some of the recordings that were too large in the past to be hosted on the Facebook page are now able to be posted on that YouTube page. So that's a great new development for us. So if you know somebody who really wanted to be here today but missed it, they can go back and listen to the recording later. And those things are linked here in the PowerPoint slide. So that's my only other note in logistics is that I will send a follow-up email this afternoon to all of our attendees, and that will include a link so that you can download the PowerPoint slides, and that includes all of the links to resources that are in the presentation. I'll also make a note of any other resources that come up. So if attendees share a new resource or something, I can add that to that follow-up email. And the slides actually right now are uploaded and available at our SlideShare account at slideshare.net/training-institute. All right. I don't see any questions right now. People are rolling in. Just quickly, an overview of what we're planning to cover today. Really looking at federal funding for mentoring programs. Again, past, present, and future. The historical context, what are some sources of federal funding, current status, and with Joellen Gonders-Basic, our panelists, to hear some of the considerations for future funding for mentoring programs. I am going to let Alicia talk a little bit about some, because this is our Quality in Action webinar series, we like to think about how does this tie into being a quality mentoring program, and so having this connection to best practices and the elements of effective practice, and Alicia will cover that for us for the next couple of slides.
Everyone, so following the elements of effective practice, you'll want to develop a financial plan that includes a budget for your program, along with a set of how much funding you will need to start and or sustain the program. You will need to identify and secure a diversified stream of funding so you do not rely too heavily on one source. You'll need to determine how long you can expect to receive funding from each source so you can develop new sources before that funding runs out. And you will need to establish controls and auditing requirements as well as a system for managing program finances. On the CD in the toolkit includes a couple of great resources. Budget items for a mentoring program, which lays out the many types of expenses you may incur as you establish and run your program. The program liability and risk management helps you assess your potential liability and risk so you can shop around for adequate insurance and add those costs to your budget projections. And then finally, financial internal controls checklist, which provides a list of procedures you will need to follow to keep your program financially healthy. So you'll definitely want to check out those great resources. Moving on to why supporting federal funding is so important. Research demonstrates that youth who participate in mentoring relationships experience a multitude of positive benefits. In the U.S. today, 17.6 million young people, nearly half the population, want or need mentors to help them reach their full potential. And nearly 44 million adults say that they are willing to become mentors. Yet, due to capacity limitations, only 3 million youngsters are in formal mentoring relationships. This leaves nearly 15 million American young people still in need of mentors. These young people comprise the nation's mentoring gap. So without funding, programs won't be able to recruit, train, and support the mentors to help close that gap. 78% of programs admitted that funding was difficult, and over 50% of programs are concerned that they will shrink in size or end their operations, which is very vital to closing that gap. But most mentoring programs are initiated by nonprofit organizations, faith-based institutions, community groups that have little or no capital. Given the costs involved in effectively serving the young people in need of mentoring around the country, mentoring programs must have access to adequate funding to run high-quality programs and increase the number of children served. So, and if you want to take a deeper look, down below at the end or at the bottom of the slide is the link to that. So you can go ahead and check that out as well. And now I'm going to kick it back to April to introduce our panelist, Joellen.
Hi, and we are excited to have our own Executive Director, Joellen Gonder-Spacek, joining us as our presenter, our panelist today. It's shocking to me that she has not been a panelist in all the time we have done these webinars already. But Joellen Gonder-Spacek is the founding Executive Director of the Mentoring Partnership of Minnesota. She's been with us since 1994 and has led the strategic direction of one of the original mentoring partnerships in the United States. So mentoring partnerships don't go terribly far back, but Minnesota's been around for a long time. Joellen has 20 years of experience in resource development, community mobilization, partnership development, strategic planning, marketing communications, and social entrepreneurism. In 2008, Joellen was the first recipient of the Manza Excellence in Leadership Award from Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. And in 2009, she was chosen to receive a Bush Foundation Leadership Fellowship, which gave her the opportunity to earn a master's degree at the University of Minnesota Humphrey Institute in Public Affairs and Nonprofit Leadership. And so really it's the Bush Fellowship that got us talking about. We have our shared files here at the Mentoring Partnership and on our server, and Joellen shared her papers from her pursuing her master's degree and throughout the Bush Fellowship, and looking through some of those and thinking about how do we take some of that learning and some of that knowledge and share that with the field, and settled on looking at some of the research and work that she's done during that fellowship and in the context of her work in the mentoring field to look at public funding for mentoring programs. So that said, we're going to hand over and we'll start hear from Joellen and talk about the federal funding, past, present, and future, but just to encourage you also that thinking of questions for the, at the end of the webinar, feel free to ask questions about her fellowship and other projects and anything else that she learned through that process as well. She's a great resource for all of us. So thank you, Joellen, for sharing, and I will advance slides for you, but I'll mute myself right now.
Thanks, April and Alicia. Thanks to both of you for your leadership in really moving the whole Quality in Action webinars forward. As many of you on the webinar today know that April was the initiator of this, and Mentor has subsequently picked up on pieces of this, but she really is the brainchild behind doing this whole series from the get-go. So thank you again for your leadership, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this today. I'll start with a bit of a disclaimer before we go into a poll here. But I don't claim to be an expert on public funding for mentoring, but I did think having put a little blood, sweat, and tears into some research on public funding for mentoring, that it certainly seemed appropriate to share what I found and also to share where I saw that there are some gaps in our knowledge as well as in our collective understanding of how we can further expand investments, public investments in youth mentoring. So I wrote this paper for a class that was called Public Policy Redesign, and it was taught by a former finance commissioner, Professor Jay Krudowski, and I think he brings a really broad depth of experience both from the public and the private sectors on how you can really improve our public policies as well as our public investments. So he challenged me quite a bit as I was preparing this paper, and really I think forced me to think about things differently, which is part of what I'm hoping will happen today in our Q&A portion, that you guys will begin to think about how we're working together on this public funding side of the equation, maybe in some different ways. But with that, I'll stop, and I think April's going to put up our first poll that we wanted to get just a quick tab on those of you who currently receive federal funding for your mentor program. So if you would go ahead and just vote yes or no. I think she just gives you a couple minutes to do this, and then she'll share the results.
Oh, here we go. Okay, so we're looking at about 50-50 here of yes and no for our participants right now.
Well, that is actually kind of the ideal situation, in that some of you may be looking for some just kind of context, some of that public funding 101 perspective, which of course I had to provide in that paper that I wrote, but also kind of those of you who've been recipients of public and federal funding and are definitely more sophisticated. I hope you'll add your perspective too as we go along. Well, historically, let's move to the next slide that Alicia helped me put together, that really kind of, I think, does a really nice job of laying out where the primary federal funding has come from, particularly over the last decade. And there's really been two primary sources.
There we go.
You can see,
okay. There was a little delay in then getting back over to the slide, so sorry about that.
Oh,
here we
thank
go.
you. No worries. No worries. Thank you. For those of you who've been in this world for a while will remember that the Mentoring for Success Act was introduced in early 2000 by Congressman Tom Osborne from Nebraska, and he really played an instrumental role in not only introducing that legislation, but also introducing the funding that would support that legislation. And so the initial funding for both the Mentoring for Success Act at the $50 million level, as well as the Mentoring for Children of Prisoners program, also at the $50 million level, was some of the first dollars in this decade, at least, that were allocated specifically from a competitive grant point of view. President Bush in 2004, between 2004 and 5, introduced in his budget $450 million over 3 years through the Department of Education and Department of Health and Human Services. However, Congress pulled that back and they kept the funding at the same level as the previous allocation, $50 million each for the Mentoring for Success and Children of Prisoners programs. And again, I know there are people on the phone or on the webinar today that have been recipients of that. In late 2007, early 2008, President Bush proposed elimination of the Mentoring for Success funding and a reduction in the mentoring of children prisoners. So it looks like the President and Congress flipped roles, because then Congress decided to preserve the funding during that time frame and kept it at $100 million. So it's been a positive thing that it's been maintained over this period of the last 8+ years. The current administration, President Obama, proposes the elimination of the Mentoring for Success funding, and some of this, unfortunately, is founded on a somewhat controversial school-based mentoring study that was done that I know that Mentor, our national office, has found to not be a completely valid or reliable study, but the Office of Budget and Management made the recommendation to the Obama administration that the Mentoring for Success funding should be eliminated until there's further research done to show stronger evidence that school-based mentoring is effective. However, the President has proposed to preserve the Children of Prisoners funding.
Yeah, I was just going to say we've done previous webinars on that school-based mentoring study as well, and we can include that link in our follow-up email.
Perfect. Yeah, so I think, again, all of us need to be aware of how critical it is to make sure that research that is released about mentoring is both valid and reliable and follows the best research practices. But obviously all of us need to be critical consumers, if you will, of that research and be able to ask those tough questions about what it's actually saying and or going to be driving in terms of funding. Well, on to the next slide. I think we're going to do another poll.
Poll first, would you like?
Poll, I think poll first, yes.
Okay.
Thanks, April. And while I've just gone over mostly the competitive grant part of federal funding, the other thing I'm curious to know is if you've received other forms of federal funding for your mentor programs in the form of contracts, formula or block grants, either from a state or a locality, the discretionary project grants, we know that half of you have received that, or none or don't know. So if you take a minute and vote, and then April will share with us the results of that.
This one's taking a little longer for folks to vote. Here we go. I think I had to read through the list in order to be able to vote. So probably just going to go about 10 more seconds, and then we'll go ahead and close and share the results. It's kind of all categories are represented. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close. I apologize if you were unable to get your vote in already. And here we go. We do have one question as well that asks, where do earmarks fall?
And that is a really, really good question, because actually I would almost consider that a fourth type of funding. As far as we know, only Boulder Options in the state of Minnesota has received earmarks, unless I'm mistaken. April or Alicia has other. I didn't dig into that very deeply in my research, but I think that's the only organization that we know of that's received a federal earmark.
But all kinds of them. And then I think what's interesting is the percentage of people, and we added this later, the option of saying don't know or you're not sure, that you might know you have federal funding, but you're not sure which kind it is. So that's interesting. I'm going to hide that then and go to your next slide.
Yeah. Because I think this gets to that point of the folks who don't know, that contracts tend to be, and this is where the definitions will come up in a second, that between federal, state, or local government and private or public agencies, and it really requires a provision of some kind of a specified services and standards, performance standards. The second type of federal funding, this formula or block grants. Those are, I think most people are familiar with, those are usually administered by states and or in our case often by counties, and really offers some flexibility for some of you who maybe received Hennepin, Ramsey, or other county funding across the state of Minnesota. Those, again, are attractive because they offer some flexibility. And then the discretionary project grants, which we just spoke to, that would include the Mentoring for Success and the Children of Prisoners funding.
We did have another comment, too, from somebody who is a subcontractor for a mentoring grant. So he was just pointing out that he checked contracts, but
Yep.
Just to clarify that, which I guess that would be the case for the mentoring partnership as well. Yeah.
Exactly. And for those of you who don't know, that when some of our mentor program partners have received federal funding, they've actually written the mentoring partnership in, often to provide training or technical assistance on a variety of different of the quality standards. And so I would say that's been the only form of public dollars that the mentoring partnership has received over the course of our organizational lifetime, is through these contracting. So I think that's actually a very smart strategy. And for those of you who maybe are also contemplating pursuing this contracting feature, that it is a smart strategy both at the state and the federal level. So I just plant that idea for maybe further discussion in our Q&A section. Well, let me give you, onto the next slide, a broader view of all the different federal funding sources, some which may be familiar to you and some which may not. What I found in my research, that there are actually 25 federal funding sources for mentoring that are administered by 8 federal agencies, and Alicia was kind enough to try to track down the logos and icons of all of those different funding sources, including Department of Ed, Department of Health and Human Services, which we've already talked about, the Corporation for National and Community Service, which I'll talk about a little bit later, Department of Justice, which will continue to be, I think, one of the primary sources of federal funding in the near term, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Labor, Department of Defense, and Department of Agriculture. And I don't know if any of you have received funding from some of the last 3 or 4, but I found that rather interesting. The Finance Project did a really terrific piece back in 2008 that really summarized all these federal funding sources over the last 10 or so years, and we've listed it as part of our resources that you can reference later. But I thought it was one of the best pieces I found out there that really explains federal funding, as well as quantified who actually is offering opportunities for federal funding. Right here in Minnesota, we have 2 programs that have been recipients of federal dollars of late through the Department of Health and Human Services, the Mentoring for Children of Prisoners program, Lutheran Social Service, and the Bridge for Youth. We received about $250,000 between the 2. And the most recent Department of Ed grant recipients, which now has stopped, but that was the Northland Area Family Service Center and Common Bond Communities that received collectively about $380,000. And many of you may know we here in Minnesota receive a relatively small percentage of these federal funds compared to some other states, and some of that is based on need and kind of our youth population, but that is what it is often. On to the next slide. I think this slide I borrowed from our good friends Dare Mighty Things, who, I don't know if any of you were on this webinar that they had last week, but I thought they did a really nice job of capturing, and this goes back now 16 years, really where those federal funding sources were and the amounts that were allocated. I didn't talk about the stimulus funding or recovery money, but certainly that has come into play recently, and I think for the most part that those dollars are no longer available, but that certainly played a factor in the last couple years or so. And back to the Dare Mighty Things webinar, I'm trying to get a recording of their webinar that we would make available to our stakeholder groups. Again, I think they did a really nice job of including some people from the Corporation for National and Community Service, as well as a woman who's the former Texas Education Agency Director on at-risk youth programs, and really graphically laying out where some of these federal funding sources are and what the feds are going to be looking for moving forward. And I'll get to that on the next slide.
Did you want to launch the last poll here?
Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped right over that. Yeah.
We'll just I'll go ahead.
Thanks, April.
Here we go.
So the question is, my program has received funding in the past 3 years. From which of these? We asked if you, the 50% who said you did, we'd like to know which one.
Or we might have people who've received federal funding in the past, but not recently.
Not recently, right?
Mm-hmm. All right, I think we're about ready to close here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close, and you can see. So yeah, the majority, so maybe having some of those contracts or other things in there might have affected that then too, but so again, an even split between those two, and then a big chunk of folks who have not received funding in the past few years.
Mm-hmm. It's also been interesting as an aside that I've gotten more inquiries from private funders and family foundations who want to know what other funding sources mentor programs have received too. So we're contemplating maybe doing some kind of outreach to get a better handle on that. I think it would tell our collective story probably more clearly if we did have a handle on that. We're thinking that might be an intern job this summer.
We do have a question too about OJJDP, the JUMP grants. So where does an Office of Justice grant come in?
Well, and I think that from what you could see on that previous chart that the JUMP grants were available up through 2002, but we don't, right now it does not look like there's going to be additional JUMP funding. I think what Justice has done is repackage some of those funding opportunities, and I'll talk a little bit more about eligibility and who might be able to access some of that justice money. But right now it's primarily in the children of prisoners category, and then I guess possibly there could be some other justice money there too, but we haven't seen anything on the horizon yet.
I think we're talking about there are programs who currently have OJJDP funding through the gang prevention or foster care initiatives or second chance grants, so some of that justice money.
Oh, yes. Yes, I see what you're saying. Yeah, which again, those probably came as part of either block grants that came down to cities or counties, I assume, or were subcontracting opportunities to mentor programs. Is that kind of how they've worked?
Some. I don't think so, though. No. Just OJJDP grantees. But you see that jump, the 2009-2010 for the blue, where some of that money shifted from the Department of Ed and into more of a focus on the OJJDP, but with the addition of that stimulus funding.
Right. Well, the next slide that I wanted to go over was, again, more of a primer, I guess, on just how the budget process works. Some of you may be familiar with this, but I think it's good for all of us to be grounded in this, and this also came from Dare Mighty Things, that typically in the early part of the year the President releases his budget, and then this is the time of year, March through September, when the House and Senate pass back versions of the budget, and then the next fiscal year budget is passed sometime in the fall, typically October, November. If Congress doesn't pass the budget, there are these what they call continuing resolutions to keep funding at current year levels. And I won't get into a big explanation of what a continuing resolution is, but relevant to know that there is this contingency that helps keep funding in place if need be, particularly as all of us are aware of the looming deadline for this Friday for the new federal budget to be in place so that the government doesn't shut down. So there are these continuing resolutions that helps keep the funding going. This year's process is a little different in that the President, again, releases the budget in February, and the House and Senate they're saying may not approve the budget, the president then would release his 2012 budget, and then there would be a continuing resolution that it would be extended, as we've talked about through this week. What we heard from Dare Mighty Things is that there is a best case scenario where that continuing resolution through April takes place and the funding is preserved at the 2010 levels for that $100 million for those two pieces of legislation. However, there could be minor tweaks and or cuts to the 2011 budget. And right now the Senate is recommending a $61 million cut and the House is recommending a $10 million cut. So that's $71 million out of the $100 million. It's really hoped that there will be a compromise with that $31 to $32 million funding cut to get it to $31 million cut versus a $71 million cut. So pretty severe, which probably isn't a surprise to any of you on the webinar today. And the next slide, before I go into some broader considerations, really made the point of those of us that are invested in ensuring that the highest quality mentor program practices are the candidates that are eligible to receive federal funding, that it looks like there will be continued emphasis on this evidence-based practices with particular emphasis on match retention. If you haven't heard this, Dare Mighty Things made quite a bit of a fine point on this, that tracking and improving match retention, really building on research that all of us are familiar with, showing that longer-term relationships make bigger impacts on young people's lives, will become a bigger driver in their funding decisions. The third element is this official records component, that there's going to be a major change in requiring official records of youth outcomes. There will be no longer self-reporting, that, for example, that you'll have to secure school records in order to be eligible to apply for federal funding. And then the fourth element, which probably has some pros and cons to it, is that this concept of partnering and wraparound services will become a bigger variable in funding decisions. Either you will have to have had pre-existing partnerships that are supporting youth in comprehensive ways, or your programs will need to be lining up or aligning on these wraparound services, which I thought that was interesting, and again, I think poses some challenges but opportunities as well. And with that, I'll close before we go to the questions with what I came up with were my recommendations for this public policy redesign. And the first being that I believe that federal agencies and federal funding should only go towards those programs that can prove evidence-based best practices for youth mentoring. Many of you have been involved in the QMAP process, our quality mentoring assessment program and path, and so those are the types of programs that we believe that should be the best candidates for federal funding. Secondly, that there needs to be some kind of a scientifically based research tool that could track mentor program outcomes on an aggregate basis. Our national office has introduced the tool called Mentor Pro that would allow programs to aggregate across programs as well as across the country, and I think that there's a growing need to do that. That poses a whole myriad of other challenges, but I think there is a growing need for that. The third, which isn't a new idea, but I think it needs to be resurrected, is a federal mentoring council that would represent all of these federal agencies that are investing in youth mentoring, that they could work together to establish a progressive research agenda, and I think work with some of those other experts, those national organizations like Mentor and Big Brothers and Sisters and others at the corporation, that they could find, particularly addressing this issue that I know you guys already have talked about, where that school-based study and the findings from that school-based study, and they probably could have headed that off at the pass, if they had been able to be working together in some kind of a more collaborative fashion. This did happen a few years back, but I think it's the federal agencies have kind of fallen away from these regular conversations. The fourth recommendation I had was to really look at ways we could regionalize some of our training, technical assistance, and research agendas. For those of you who are familiar with the Northwest Regional Labs, I think that that's an interesting model that maybe could have some play from a capacity building point of view. And then the last recommendation I had was really reinforcing and validating the role of the Corporation for National and Community Service and the role of our AmeriCorps, Senior Corps, Vistas, in the role that they play in both capacity building, direct service for the support of our mentor programs. So with that, I will stop and entertain questions, and I think April and Alicia may help me with that.
Yeah, so this is a great time to get some interaction from our participants. If you have questions to share, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and we can just have a conversation that way if you're equipped with that kind of audio capability, or type your question or comment into the control panel in the question section. We did get a comment from just a little more information, so from OJJDP grantees about who are not receiving Recovery Act funding, but another person in a program in Minnesota that has the Strengthening Youth Mentoring Through Community Partnerships grant, and we've had several recent recipients, pretty recent, with the Foster Care Initiative and Second Chance Mentoring Act, or Second Chance Mentoring Program, and the Gang Prevention Initiative as well. All right, here's a question about any suggestions on how to acquire school records given the privacy laws in Minnesota. We've encountered resistance to our requests. I think that's pretty common, yeah.
Right, and I think what I heard on the webinar last week that Dare Mighty Things hosted was the importance of developing that relationship directly with an individual school. I don't think there's a silver bullet, to be honest with you, and I know that the Department of Education as well as individual school districts have varying policies on how you access those records, so probably first to ground yourself in what those policies are, and then secondly that building the relationship and building it in up front when you're talking about how you're going to evaluate your program, and ensuring that you have agreement on that and probably some written documentation on that. And I know, April, you may have some other thoughts on how to help people do that.
No, mostly just knowing that programs who even feel like they've done that due diligence ahead of time before they applied for the grant, then the problem is then once you actually get the funding and actually getting folks to follow through with that, and sometimes it's not ill intention, it's you have all the things in place, it's just the capacity even of the school to process that request. One example of a successful workaround or a way of working with that is in St. Paul with the tutoring partnership, so that they've can kind of run that data in batches for those tutoring programs that are meeting those best practices. And so if they're working with the St. Paul Public Schools Foundation and their tutoring partnership, then they're getting that kind of support and training and quality control, and then in return getting some of that data. But I don't know if that's a perfect system either, but thinking about, like Joellen said, those relationships and partnerships, and how do you facilitate getting that data. It can be really tricky. There are other programs too that have gone so far as to do their own testing or do their own gathering some of that academic data. But if we're looking at what Joellen was sharing, that we're going to be looking more at official records as opposed to self-reporting, then that might be a challenge for programs looking for public funding.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see here. Got another question of how can we efficiently find or track opportunities, formula block or discretionary grants, competitive opportunities?
Well, we do receive regular updates from grants.gov, I guess, is one source. The trick with that one is that it's everything in the kitchen sink, so it doesn't necessarily, we try to sift through that, the mentoring partnership, and identify opportunities for mentor programs. We also get that information from Mentor, and they note that on their website on a regular basis. So that would be two of my recommendations. Make sure you're on our e-newsletter distribution as well as the Mentor website.
All right, I'm just pulling up a couple things just to show. This is the funding for mentoring section of Mentor's website. There was also a resource here. The Center for Advancement of Mentoring is another resource that is there, but they're a technical assistance and training provider for OJJDP funded youth mentoring programs. But in their resources section, if we look to program sustainability, and I had seen, there's Office of Justice Programs Grants 101, kind of might be a place to start, but there's lots of different resources at the in these slides at the end of the slides that we'll click through that can take you to some of those places that might help you find different ways of tracking that. And I have Mayanne. I'm going to unmute you here for a moment. Mayanne is with the Mentoring Partnership. Mayanne, are you equipped here? I'll unmute you. Hello. We can't hear you if you're speaking. Let me see if she wrote something into our question section. Here's another. I think Mayanne was just pointing out that in order to get funding announcements from the Mentoring Partnership of Minnesota, so if you want to get those updates from MPM, you just need to register your program with our website, and then we'll send those funding updates out. And Linda Otow in Northfield, a federal grant recipient, her program of successful applicant for funding, but the mentoring forums with the National Mentoring Center out of Education Northwest that I think Joellen mentioned, they do a good job of updating those as well. I have another comment. Somebody said, we were just trying to get graduation figures, so we got the school's commencement programs with names published in them. So it was another way to work around for that whole getting that official report that they couldn't get, maybe couldn't get a report directly from the school, but just got commencement programs with names published. So there's an idea to share.
Clever.
Feel free to share your comments and ideas as well. I might go back here and show some of the other resources that are here. So these are some of the things that Alicia had mentioned from Mentor in their resources, but to look for the Advocate for Mentoring section and some of those pieces, but I also showed you the section on funding for mentoring programs. We also wanted to mention, because of the webinar that we participated in last week, but the Dare Mighty Things, another place where funding opportunities might pop up would be in their new resource section for Dare Mighty Things in the arena. So there's the mentoring forums with the National Mentoring Center, but this is another spot as well.
April, could I also interject on that previous slide? You don't have to go back to it, but that there was a note there about the House Mentoring Caucus that Betty McCullum is one of the co-chairs of, and we just found out from Mentor last week that they're going to now try to establish a Senate caucus as well, so we're going to recommend Senator Franken to be part of that and hope that that comes to fruition. That also makes a dramatic difference on access to federal funding for mentoring.
Great. Also wanted to include, as we mentioned, Dwellin was a recent Bush Fellow in the Bush Fellowship Program through the Bush Foundation. So this is another resource that is there if you want to learn more about that program. Also the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I just was showing you the Center for the Advancement of Mentoring site, but they have that whole and that section that they have on resources for program sustainability. You know, and those resources, some of those would be cross-listed on Mentor site, but also on the National Mentoring Center as well. But this is training and technical assistance, the current training and technical assistance provider for those OJJDP grantees. And we have, again, Fundraising Fundamentals, another resource here. The Federal Mentoring Council, this is another website, but thinking about the Corporation for National and Community Service and along with Mentor and looking at that council that we were just mentioning. And this is the Finance Project resource that Joellen mentioned as well, that is a great resource, and I've heard mentoring programs talk about how valuable they have found that resource to be. So if you download the slides, you can easily click on there and check out those resources. Let me see if I have any other questions. Other questions or comments from the group, or want to share your suggestions or funding that you're pursuing in the near future. I know there's a recent announcement about mentoring for young people with disabilities, so it'll be again from that OJJDP end of things, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I will get through here. So again, this presentation and others on slideshare.net, just for the slides themselves. And we will post the recording on our YouTube channel, also available on our Facebook page. Let's see what we have here for another question. We've got just a thanks from someone, and we do have a little more time, but if we don't have any more questions, we can go ahead and move on through, or we can stay on too if you have additional questions that you want to just address to the group. Our next Quality in Action webinar is May 4th, and we'll focus on mentor program evaluation, which clearly has a strong link to federal funding. Working with lots of mentoring programs who are currently funded, receiving public funding, and are getting ready to do some of their first reports and really digging deeply into mentor program evaluation. I'm also working with the Center for the Advancement of Mentoring and their national a group of mentoring programs, mentoring practitioners and mentoring partnerships and training and technical assistance providers to look at how do we make that evaluation process more manageable for those grantees. But one great tool is the evaluation instrument toolkit created by Oregon Mentors along with the National Mentoring Center. So we'll have both Mike Geringer and Celeste Jansen with us to do a demo of that toolkit and to talk about, you know, it's really nice because you can look at it and see 70 plus different instruments or surveys that you could use to evaluate your program. And what this webinar will do is give you a little tour and help us kind of narrow that down or think about how to search through that. Mayan, I think you have your hand up. I'm going to give you another shot here to chime in.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry about the audio problems. I think I figured it out. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Just a couple of things I wanted to add in terms of observations. One, in terms of the workaround for school grades. One of the things that we're looking into, and I've put in a couple of calls to the Department of Ed, is each student in the public education system has a unique number. And one of our previous grant writers and I were discussing how mentoring programs could get access to those unique student numbers and those are tied to their academic achievements, to see if there's a way for mentoring programs to be able to aggregate the data based on the students versus individual students. So you would have a record tied to them, but you wouldn't know exactly which student is doing better. You would just know in that group the students are either doing better or maybe staying the same. So that's one of the things that we're looking at, and if and when we learn more about that, we certainly will pass it on. The other thing is around funding announcements. I'm connected to a LinkedIn group through our IT provider of all people, and they do a lot of national and local searches for funding. And so I believe if I'm linked in with you, I can invite you to be part of that group, and you can get those sent to you via LinkedIn.
Okay. Looked like we lost you there towards the end, Mayanne, but we heard about the LinkedIn piece. So I can include that in the follow-up email for everyone, and how to contact Mayanne for additional information. We'll continue to look at program sustainability. Just to know too that the mentoring partnership and you can contact me as well, and I'll include this in the follow-up email. If you are thinking about applying for funding, if you haven't applied before, or any assistance you need with implementing your grant, our quality mentoring assessment path has been really helpful for programs in getting up and running, and have heard that their grant administrators are pleased to see that they're involved in a process that's helping them improve the quality of the program that they're delivering. But also, help sifting through some of those program evaluation resources, some of the training tools that we have. But we've also done letters of support or for grant applications to help strengthen that, to show that you have that partnership, or that you're working with the mentoring partnership in your existing or the planning for a new mentoring initiative. So we are here to help beyond this webinar, and we hope that more and more of the programs in our network are able to secure that funding, and to continue advocating for the continuation and hopefully expansion of all of those sources of federal funding that were identified. And I think if there are no other questions, we will go ahead and end the webinar here, and look forward to that follow-up email, and any questions that you have, you can certainly direct to us offline as well. Thanks so much. We hope to see you next month and in future webinars.
Thank you.